Right. Welcome back, students. We are still in chapter 30. And this time we're going to talk about Reagan and Bush's economy and their domestic issues. There are a lot of different things that are going on during the presidencies of both these individuals. Chapter 30 is really structured in an odd way where it breaks them into little sections so they don't quite jive with each other. So you have one thing where you have like economics and domestic policy, and then you have the other one where it's foreign policy. You have a lot of variable elements going on here. In chapter 30, I'm not overly happy with how it's structured. So I am, during my time off over the summer, probably going to try to restructure chapter 30 in a sensical manner. Okay, but one other thing, make sure you guys read the announcement today that is on the main page. Chapter 30 is shifting. Today I'm only going to try to cover 30.3. I'm hoping I'll make it through. If not, read the rest of the chapter, look through the PowerPoint. This is a really long unit even for this little section, but chapter 30 test. The chapter 30 test is now going to be optional. By optional, I mean you do not have to take it and it won't count against you. But if you do take it, which I hope you all do, then you will take that score. So if you get really good on chapter 30 test and you score a 25, you can then take that and apply it to any of the other test scores that you were not happy with. So if you manage to somewhere, kind of slice a hit, I guess the best way to use it, golf term. If you hit a slice and you wanted to get rid of that 15 and move to a 25, this would be your ability to do it. Now, also notated on that main screen where I have the announcement, you have to remember I am not going to be doing a review for this section. I'm not going to put up a review PowerPoint. You are still responsible for doing the chapter 30 study guide. That's your homework, and then you can use that for your test. So make sure that you study it and you get that one done, because I'm not going to go over and do a review, because this is going to be a free ball test for you guys that you will be able to take a nice swing and hopefully hit a home run and be able to replace a bad test score. Anyways, let's jump right back in here to 30.3, okay? So when we talk about the 1980 election, when Reagan comes into power, he doesn't just beat Jimmy Carter, he smashes Jimmy Carter. I mean, he beats him one of the most lopsided elections, again, in presidential history. Ronald Reagan is a fascinating president. He is still widely revered in conservative Republican circles. Lots of people really look at Reagan and say, this is what a Republican president should look like. So when you talk about Reagan, it's important to kind of understand him, because when people start talking about a politician and say they're Reagan-esque, they're talking about this president right here, President Ronald Reagan. So he was an actor, mostly in what we would consider now kind of B movies. I've seen a few of Ronald Reagan's movies back in the day. He doesn't just come from nowhere. He's not just an actor, but he was also the governor of California. He was trying to get elected in 1976. He tried to run for president during that time frame, but Carter wins. One of the things, though, is in the 70s, this is where he starts to really get his rise to power, where he starts to really approach the religious right and the conservative elements of the Republican Party to really shore up his base and be able to eventually take the Republican nomination. The other thing is that he is known, and this is mentioned a lot of him, called the Great Communicator. He had a very gentle style of being able to talk to people and convince them to come to his side. The other thing is that he was very funny. He would often, during times that should be serious, would crack jokes and make fun of different people. He would be self-deprecating sometimes too, but he was very likable. He really, coming from a Hollywood background, he really commanded the screen. So if it was a television interview, then often he was on his A game, and people would just see who he was, and he'd be able to really get people to listen to his views and his ideas. So that's Reagan right here at the very beginning. Couple of his goals. Reagan comes up from the 1940s and 50s. He's anti-communist all the way. In fact, so much so he really wants to try to take on the Soviet Union and finally bring it to an end. So he does this through a few things that we'll talk about later. One of the things, though, is that he looks at in trying to pull us out of the downturn of the 1970s and going into the 1980s is he tries a couple different methods in order to try to bring the economy back up. First thing he does is he reduces taxes and tries to reduce regulations for businesses. By doing this, he hoped that it would then incentivize companies to hire more workers and improve the economy. He had the theory that the government that governs the least governs the best, so he wanted a smaller government. He was very pro traditional family, and when I say traditional family, I'm talking about like family elements from the 1950s is kind of what he sees as the ideal family environment. Really, you have to remember into the 60s and 70s, you're going through what's considered the sexual revolution in American history, and you start to see some cracks into what is considered the traditional family scenario where you have mother and father living in the same home with the kids, raising them, where in the 70s and into the 80s, you start seeing this really breakup of the traditional family, more single parents. So you start to see the rise in that, and that's why Reagan pushes this idea of traditionalism back on there. Also, he has a lot of backing from religious organizations and individuals. This is, again, kind of goes along with his pro-traditional family values, and he really pushes religion back out there too. His whole thing was really latching onto the religious right category that helped support Nixon, and then again, they come back again and really prop up Reagan during this time frame. When we look at his economy, so he looks at reducing taxes. He tries to drop historically high taxes in some cases down to like 35% for business, 25% for individuals. If taxes are dropped, his viewpoint is that they will hire more people and they'll bring manufacturing jobs, or they'll bring new factories back to the United States, which will then employ more people. Also, lower taxes typically are supposed to benefit consumers because this gives them a few extra dollars in their pockets to go out and buy and engage in the market again, so that they can really stimulate the market by using purchasing power and buying material and consumer goods. Also, the other thing he looks at is he has this idea that he's going to try to save money by cutting down social programs. So you see a reduction of everything from food stamps to Medicaid, Medicare. You see him cut out job training programs. He closes a lot of them. Like, one of the things that he closes is federally controlled or federally sponsored or paid for mental hospitals. So a lot of people blame kind of the current homeless mental health crisis on Reagan closing down these types of hospitals, trying to slash the federal budget. And the interesting thing with Reagan is he says he wants to get rid of wasteful government spending. Yet under Reagan, some of the highest deficits spending since World War II occur under his watch because of cutting taxation. There's the philosophy that if you cut taxes and they hire more people, that you'll remake that tax revenue back again. Again, the economy is still slumping, and that manufacturing jobs were not likely to come back to America because cheap overseas foreign companies, they can make things cheaper, and Americans were willing to pay the lower price for them. And lastly, he looked at using deregulation, which is basically cutting out some of the rules of the government of how things operated. People believe that he cut a lot of environmental protection items, which he did, which created some environmental hazards and problems with some manufacturing sections. His idea, of course, was called Reaganomics. That's what we talked about right there. Basically, you cut taxes on the highest makers, so cut taxes on the richest and the businesses, and hopefully that money comes spilling down and helps out people in the middle and lower classes. So trickle-down economics, that's basically what it's known as. All right. So things that happen under Reagan that help him is oil prices start to correct themselves. Higher production of foreign oil across the board forces oil prices down. One thing you need to understand is oil doesn't just work for gasoline. There's so much in manufacturing that uses oil. Most of your plastics are made out of oil. So this helps stimulate some of the manufacturing section of the American economy again. Also, some inflation numbers start to go down. Interest rates drop so that people can borrow money more readily, and same with businesses. When businesses can borrow money, usually, again, they're able to stimulate and hire people and push production numbers up higher. Also, you see some unemployment start to come down right before Reagan's second election. You see a spike again, but it's not nearly as severe as it was at the beginning of Reagan's term coming out of Jimmy Carter's era. In his second term, he runs against Walter Mondale, and basically Mondale is no match for Reagan. Again, even worse than Jimmy Carter, Mondale is just absolutely crushed in the general election. As you can see, all he carries is Minnesota. But one of the things is we talked about this: less taxes means less tax dollars, and he really starts trying to push back against the Soviet Union. So he starts really massively ramping up defense spending. Now, while this is good for some sectors of the economy, like defense contractors, at the same time, in order to pay for it, he starts borrowing money, creating more and more deficits. Also, right before he leaves office in 1988, because of a lot of deregulations in the financial industry and the financial market especially, you see what is called Black Monday, and where you have a massive drop in the stock market. And it's almost, in some scenarios, if you look at like the numbers lost, it's almost as bad as the Great Depression stock market crash in 1928. However, there was a lot of regulations that have been placed on the stock market to stop trading and stop runs. And so that's one thing that really saves the American economy from just, instead of just going into a recession, into a depression. So you have needs for regulation in the market. When those protective measures are taken out, you see events like the Black Monday. One other thing too is you start seeing domestic issues that still exist in Reagan's America. So there's a couple things. I remember we talked about affirmative action. You start to see white people challenge affirmative action and suing, saying that it's reverse discrimination. Ronald Reagan, he really starts to push the Supreme Court to the right. And so you see some initial decisions from the Supreme Court that actually agree that there are some elements of affirmative action are discriminatory in nature. You see inner city employment. So while you see employment improve in more of the white class suburban neighborhoods, it doesn't improve in the inner city. In fact, inner city continues to suffer from very high unemployment. With unemployment comes inability to collect tax dollars. So if you have a poor inner city working group that doesn't make much money, then they cannot effectively fund the government. Remember, we talked about New York City almost going bankrupt? Well, if you can't fund your city properly, you have poor schools, you have poor police departments, you have poor public services, and this really starts to happen within the inner cities, especially like in New York, Chicago, areas like that. You start to see inner city rot. And the other thing too is if people are not working, 90% of the time you're going to see an increase in crime in a region too, because people are going to find a way to try to make ends meet. And many of them have to resort to criminal activity in order to make it meet their basic needs. And so you see a rise of crime in that front. But then one other huge thing comes out during this time frame, and that is the crack epidemic. Crack cocaine comes out, and it is one of the most highly addictive yet cheap drugs that are easily produced, manufactured, and distributed on the street. It basically ruins inner city African American communities with addiction, but also crime, because crack does a couple of things with criminal element. First off, it comes and makes a rise of gang activity. Somebody needs to make, produce, and distribute the drug. So you have gangs that are fighting over territory of who makes money selling the drug. You then have crack addicts who become so addicted that they lose everything. They no longer work jobs. They're unemployed. So the only way to maintain their habit is to resort to criminal activity. So you see a lot of criminality rise out of the crack cocaine epidemic that strikes inner city Americas in the early 80s and into even the mid 80s. Crack cocaine is still a problem today, but it was a massive problem during those time frames. In order to try to fight it, they declare a war on drugs. They crack down hard on drug usage, and you really start to see heavy-handed enforcement in inner city communities. You wonder why people are always talking about aggressive police measures. They come out of the 1970s and 1980s in order to aggressively push back and fight against drugs like crack cocaine. Also, drug penalties are massively increased too. So minor offenses before are now slated with higher criminal penalties. So you have people spending more time in jail for longer periods of time for what used to be considered minor drug offenses. One of the things, hang on one second. Sorry, I needed a drink. Places like California, in an effort to fight against this lawlessness and criminalities, they institute something called the 3-strike law, which means if you get 3 felonies, by the time you hit your third felony, you will be in prison for the rest of your life. And so this happens a lot to just even minor level street dealers. So people that are carrying just enough crack cocaine or other hard drugs to carry a penalty of distribution. And this is not usually a lot of drugs when you're talking about distribution penalties. So suddenly you see mass incarceration start to occur from people with low-level drug crimes. People are getting sent to jail for the rest of their lives, not because there was a violent crime or violent felony or anything that is endangered. Well, not endangered because drug epidemics are dangerous, but not crimes that are physically harmful to people. By that, I mean like violence-wise. So you see this rise of incarceration of people that are low-level drug dealers and were arrested for low-level drug crimes. You get people that, are street dealers of even marijuana and stuff that end up in jail for the rest of their life. So in 1994, like we look at right here, 64% of all prisoners on jail were there for drugs. In the United States now, because of these types of 3 strikes laws, we have one of the largest prison populations in the world, and a lot of these strict, harsh penalties are now starting to be challenged. And America is really starting to look at reforming sentencing guidelines to try to correct the imprisonment of people for extended period of times for low-level criminal activity. You're going to start seeing that more and more pushed as we get in the next 20 to 30 years. It's already being pushed on a lower level right now, and it's only a matter of time before it really reaches national prominence to the point you see massive changes in our criminal justice system. Another thing that you have with Ronald Reagan is he appoints the first female to the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. When we talk about him shifting the court, he shifts it to a very conservative side, and it stays fairly conservative for a very long period of time after Reagan, too. And so that's one of the biggest things that a president gets to do to promote or establish a legacy is appoint Supreme Court justices. He also granted mass amnesty to illegal immigrants in a hope to try to correct the immigration issues. It did not work necessarily. As you see, even today, we still have a high number of illegal immigrants that still live in the United States. But his initial goal of amnesty was to try to end illegal immigration and bring people out of the shadow of being labeled as an illegal immigrant and being afraid to seek police help and such for other things. So lots more people were back to work at the end of Reagan's presidency. And then you get into the next election of 1988. You have George H.W. Bush, which was Reagan's vice president. He runs as the Republican nominee. The Democrats, they run into an issue of being split again. Remember, we talked about this in 1968. You have a split. And every time there's a split in a political party, often you're going to see that party lose in the general election. You get Jesse Jackson, who arises, and he's the first black candidate for a major political party. He really pushed for social justice policies and changes. He organized minority groups, and he really ran on a platform of dramatic social change for minority rights. A lot of his ideas were considered somewhat controversial, so he didn't get the nomination, but he did create a new organization of people. He called it the Rainbow Coalition. There are still elements of it left today, where he united multiple minority groups into a voting bloc. Instead, the Democrats went with the safe choice of Michael Dukakis, who was the governor of Massachusetts. That picture you see in the corner there, him riding around in that tank with the goofy helmet, some people consider that as the most embarrassing moment of his political candidacy, and which kind of sunk him. So that's why I included the picture there, because it was roundly mocked throughout the entire country and put into political ads and campaigns. Because of that, again, Bush, he soundly defeats Dukakis in the 1988 election and becomes the next president. He had a lot of experience in other elements of the government. He worked as a Navy pilot in World War II. He was the ambassador to China. And one of the things that people always point out is that he was the director of the CIA at one point. So you had clandestine operations working in Reagan's White House at times, and some people kind of look at Bush and they're like, wonder if he had a hand in it. There's no definitive proof, so I'm not trying to promote that idea, but some people in the world will promote that idea out there. He's not really a memorable president in the sense that he was wise, witty. He was more practical and sought regular solutions to problems. One of the things, though, is that when you look at Bush, when he comes in, one of his biggest campaign promises is he comes up there and he says, "Read my lips, no new taxes." And then he looks at the deficit spending and he goes, man, there's no way we can pay for this unless I raise taxes. So he has to call for raising of taxes, which basically sinks him in the 1992 election, and Clinton hammers him home with that pretty hard. He continued to fund the military, though. He continued to put billions upon billions of dollars. At one point, I believe the the defense budget was something like $300 billion of the national budget, which was one of the largest expenditures, period, of there. The other thing is that he tried to pull America out of a recession that happened right after that massive collapse that happened. He's still trying to deal with rising unemployment. And one of the things that he starts to struggle with is, we understand that manufacturing jobs are leaving overseas, but suddenly you start seeing white-collar people lose their jobs too, which is a even worse thing for the United States, because we're shifting to a service-based economy during this time frame, away from an industrial-based economy. And so when white-collar employees start losing their jobs, there's something significantly wrong in the market. And so during his presidency, as you can see, unemployment moved up to over 20% of the American population due to a lot of this recession that really hit hard on there. And a lot of it is driven from the fact that there was multiple scandals. There was regulatory issues where so much unregulated business activity was going on that it created job loss throughout the time frame. One of the things that you look at during this time is like the savings and loans crisis. When I talk about deregulations creating problems. So savings and loans associations were designed to fund people's houses for 20 to 30 years. That's their whole purpose. It was the loan money for people who would have houses for 20 to 30 years, therefore making it a safe investment and a safe way for people to put their money in there. Under deregulation programs, they were allowed to lend money to commercial ventures. Commercial ventures can be risky. So what these savings and loans associations start to do is they start to lend money to commercial companies that were building large office buildings. And with these office buildings, they were saying, oh, look, we're going to build these buildings. We're going to rent them out. We're going to make tons of money. You'll get paid back very quickly. And they're like, okay, if they're going to be so great, here's a high interest loan to do so. And when the economy basically tanks out on them, these companies now look back and say, well, we can't rent the office buildings. We're sorry. We're going to declare bankruptcy. And this happens in huge numbers, to the point that it makes many of these savings and loans associations insolvent forcing them into bankruptcy. And this creates a cascading effect where now other people are forced to start to declare bankruptcy. People are now unemployed who used to work for the savings and loans places. Some people think up to a third of these loans that were given out were actually done fraudulently. And this created another crisis within the savings and loan industry. Eventually, the FDIC, remember, it was established after the bank runs in the Great Depression. It had to pay billions of dollars out to Americans who had their money in these savings and loans. So again, raising deficit spending even higher. Under Bush, you start to see deficit spending eventually reach the tune of $4 trillion. And now we think to ourselves today, well, our national debt is somewhere upwards like $20 trillion nowadays. $4 trillion was still quite a bit even during Bush's time frame. And it would take Clinton and a Republican Congress to reach a deal where they finally balanced the budget and got a budget surplus in there. But Bush suffered when it came into the 1992 election from a number of things. He raised taxes. Businesses were performing poorly, high unemployment. You had inflation still out there. And so this opens up the doorway to Bill Clinton taking the presidency in 1992. Now, what we're going to talk about tomorrow is more of the foreign issues that happened under Bush and Reagan. All right, guys, I'm so sorry this ran so long. Hopefully you were able to make it through it. And I'll see you guys tomorrow.